Hi everyone, I'm Mark MacDonald. I'm going to be talking about measuring learning gain in multi-attempt quizzes. So this is essentially an update on a talk I gave last year at EAMS, which was about a similar topic. This is the second year I've run multi-attempt quizzes in my second year linear algebra module at Lancaster. And at the end of last year's talk, I mentioned several planned changes that I was hoping to do. I did all of those, so I'm going to report on that, and I'm also going to describe how I've been convinced that students are really learning during these quizzes. Okay, so first I'll describe what these quizzes are. They're made in stack, so they consist of stack questions. Stack I found is extremely useful especially for randomization, which is why I switched to using stack this year. So there are multiple true-false questions, which means there's like some kind of setup, here's a matrix and a vector, and then several true-false statements about that, or whatever. Recall the definition of linear independence. True-false statements about linear independence, right? So about 4 true-false statements about some generic setup. This is called multiple true-false. And the idea is that these are all related, and each of the true-false statements is testing a different specific idea that you want the students to know about, right? Okay, and then the randomization comes in because each true-false statement in the question variables section of the stack question, there's actually, I've written in multiple variants of the same kind of testing the same thing. So you could have like the negation, or you like change some numbers, or just a different rewording of the same statement. So each of the 4 true-false statements has multiple variants to it. This is all built in, each question is built into a single stack question. Okay, and then the students are allowed multiple attempts. So this year they were allowed 8 attempts. So each attempt, they get a new lot of true-false statements. It's the same setup, and they get the same feedback every time after they submit, but the statements themselves change. Okay, and so then also after each attempt, they get their marks for the whole question out of 4, but so the crucial part is they are not given the right answers. They're not told which true-false statements are true and false. They're just told their mark out of 4. Okay. So that's kind of the setup. There's a couple other details. Maybe I'll just go through. This isn't the only assessment. It's a coursework assessment. It does count for, in total, 10% of their overall grade. So each quiz is 1%. There's other coursework assessments as well. Negative marking, actually, I used this year. So in the potential response tree and stack, it was slightly confusing. I can show you how I did this. I'll upload an example question to the EAMS site so you can see how I did this. There's some negative marking that's counterbalanced by the fact that their highest mark counts. So they get 8 attempts, but it's not the last mark that counts, it's the highest one. So you need negative marking because otherwise it just inflates the grade too much. Randomly guessing true-false will give you 50%. If you're given the highest mark out of multiple attempts, it's even higher than 50%. So okay, and then in terms of what kind of questions I'm asking, it's very kind of a basic level. That's the kind of true-false questions. It's just definitions, really basic understanding. That's the level and the purpose of these quizzes. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to show you some data. So this is the effort students were apparently spending on these quizzes. So the x-axis here is the time of submission. You can see the deadline there. This is for the 5th quiz. It's a flurry of submissions near the deadline and on the day of the deadline. The y-axis is how long they had the quiz open for. So, and as I say, presumably for that time, they're usually spending it actually doing the quiz. The deadline's 2 hours, so some people just obviously left it open and it automatically submitted at the cutoff. And the darker the dot means the higher the mark. So the lighter ones meant that they got lower marks. So obviously there's some very, yeah, you can just see it's spread all over the place. Interestingly, you can see when they slept. There's a gap there at nighttime. Okay, so they were definitely spending time on this. But here's the striking graph that I want to discuss. This is a representation of the average marks across their attempts. Okay, so let me explain the lines. So there are several different lines. For example, the gray line represents the average across all attempts, only looking at the instances where a student took all 8 attempts. Okay, so, and this is the number of times that happened. So it was 209 instances where a student took all 8 attempts that week. So this is across all weeks. There's only about 200 students in the class. So on average, about 20 of those per week, they use all 8 attempts. The pink one is 7 attempts, etc. Right? And there's a couple of striking things about this. First of all, they all started out roughly in the same average, so something like 65 to 70%. This is not with negative marking. This is just the raw average based on 0 and 1, true or false. And then they all ended up, no matter how many attempts they seemed to take, the average ended up around 80. Okay, so this is roughly a degree classification. In fact, once you take into account negative marking, it's more than a degree classification difference. So there's clearly an increase. Okay, one could say, devil's advocate, maybe this is a result of them ending on a high note and they didn't actually improve. They just sort of did things a bit randomly until they ended high and then they stopped. You could make that argument, but then it doesn't explain why there's actually the in-between attempts. There seems to be a steady increase here. So this is obviously not every student. This is an average over all students. But on average, they definitely, those lines are going up. You know, I haven't done like a statistical analysis, but this is it seems to be a very clear visual representation of student learning. So I think if I can just step back, I think that where the magic is happening here is that, so students submit their answer and then they get their marks and they see which are, but they don't see which are right or wrong. So what they do is then they try and figure out which one is wrong and which one is right. So they look at their answers and say, is this right or wrong? They look at the feedback that they're given. Is there a clue in here to figure out what I did wrong so I can improve? Maybe they go back to the notes. They look, oh, maybe I misunderstood this. And they have another go. Right? And then they do the same thing and it repeats potentially 8 times. It's this really nice loop where they are using feedback potentially every time. There was a talk actually last week. Vesna described frustrations that I'm sure everyone feels with where students don't engage with feedback. You know, in single attempt assessments, they sort of get their feedback and they don't bother reading it. They move on to the next assessment. The great thing about this is that they do seem to be engaging with the feedback because there's that immediacy of I can improve right now and improve my mark right now for this assessment that's sitting in front of me. So yeah, the data appears to indicate that they're actually learning. And of course, you can't just use data to draw conclusions like this, but their student comments also seem to back this up. So for example, we have these, every module has this anonymous student survey at the end of it in Lancaster. And for this module, this year, 50 respondents. So they had a free text box where it just says like comment on an aspect of the module. So 20 of the 30 commented positively on these quizzes. It's completely unprompted. So there's 2 remarkable things about that. First of all, students almost never comment on quizzes on these student surveys. Second of all, 40% of students commenting positively on anything is remarkable. So it's really obviously indicates that something has gone well. And I think really it indicates that students are perceived that they are learning. I think that's maybe a difference that they felt in these assessments that they themselves are learning, whereas maybe in other assessments they don't feel it so much. Okay. Also, I set up this focus group because I want to roll this out across some other modules in the department. I set up a small focus group to reinforce some of the ideas that I thought I had about these students, and that did reinforce a lot of behaviors that I was hoping for, the students sort of confirmed that, yep, that's what we were doing. We were looking at our answers and trying to figure out which ones were wrong, etc. So that was great. An interesting comment that came out of that focus group was they reflected that on most online quizzes, they're actually really easy to cheat on. Whereas this one, because of the randomization, you can't really cheat on it. It's really hard to cheat on it. I mean, unless you have a friend there who you're sitting next to and say, hey, what's the answer to this? So that's great. Yeah, the randomization is a key part of how this works. Of course, the problem with the randomization is that you have to build up this huge bank of true-false questions, and this was the pain that I put myself through in 2020 when I first made these multi-attempt quizzes. But fortunately, that carried over. So this year I had took almost no effort at all, which was great. So it's that initial investment is the hard part. And so what I'm doing this year, I'm in a position, I'm the director of teaching in Lancaster in the Maths and Stats department. And so I'm in a position of influence. And so we're going to roll this out across a few other modules. I've got a paid 2-month student intern who's starting in a couple of weeks to help do that, to convert some of our existing single attempt quizzes using this stack kind of format that I've already got, changing those into a multi-attempt style. The hard part being coming up with these true-false statements. And also we're going to, in some cases, reallocate some GTA marking resources to improve the quizzes instead. Because although tutor assessed work is important, in some cases it's actually better to do it with e-assessments, which again, I don't think I have to convince people in this conference that that's the case, but I'll say it anyway. Okay, so that's all. Thanks very much for your time.